afternoon to drink my second cup of coffee, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the terrorist attack that took place at our nation's capital yesterday afternoon on Wednesday, January 6th. So for those who have not joined me before, I want to welcome you. Thank you for joining me for the second cup of coffee. This is something I do every few days each week to talk about events, talk about things going on within our country, and to go a little bit more in depth into things that are happening. And so I wanted to talk about that this morning or this afternoon. Before I do, as I always do, I want to begin by acknowledging the people whose land I'm on. So I moved to Washington, D.C. with my family from the Navajo Nation about 5.5 years ago, and we now live in the Piscataway lands. It's the Piscataway Nation who were here. They've lived here, they've hunted here, they farmed here and fished here long before Columbus got lost at sea, and they're still here. And I want to acknowledge them as the host people of these lands. I want to thank them for their stewardship of these lands. Before we go into the thing I want to talk about, which is the response, the swift and bipartisan response we need from our political leaders to what happened yesterday, I want to just start by acknowledging that we need to understand as a nation that we were attacked yesterday. We experienced a terrorist attack, and something that had never happened before in the history of our country, which is terrorists took over our U.S. Capitol. And we need to acknowledge that. That will have an emotional and a physical reaction and response from almost every American. And we need to acknowledge that. We also need to acknowledge that yesterday was, I believe, the highest death toll throughout the entire pandemic in the United States. I saw numbers between 3,900 and 4,100 was the number of people died from COVID-19 yesterday, as well as 4 people lost their lives in the terrorist attack that took place. And so we, again, just need to acknowledge that there are some incredible tragedies going on within our country. And this will take an emotional, a physical, a mental toll on all of us. And we need to make sure that we are able to stay healthy and to cope with these effectively. I tweeted this morning. Yesterday, I tweeted and I gave a live stream where I talked about the way our leaders coped with this event. And President Trump coped with it by going into denial and reiterating his claims of being a victim, and affirmed the rioters, the terrorists who were acting on his behalf and taking over and disrupting the vote counting of the Electoral College at the nation's capital and taking over the Capitol building. And he was affirming them and reaffirming the denial that he's reaffirmed for months now. And Joe Biden coped with this by telling our nation that this is not who we are and that we are still exceptional. Both of those are not good responses to this event. The challenge is this is who we are. Our nation was founded on a doctrine of discovery. We have racism, sexism, white supremacy embedded into our foundations. This is who we are. This is what we do. We need to acknowledge that, and we need to deal with it, so that we can make an intentional decision to choose, to decide to be something different tomorrow. That's how we need to cope with this. But what I want to talk about today is the response we need from our government and how we need to wrestle with this really unprecedented event where a sitting president incited and affirmed a terrorist attack on the U.S. Capitol to disrupt a voting process by our Congress so that he could delay and possibly even overturn the result that would be removing him from office, which would affirm the election of his opponent, Joe Biden, in the 2020 presidential race. And I'm grateful for everything I've been hearing today about the number of resignations from the Trump administration. I think that people do need to begin resigning in mass from this administration. And I also heard that one of his, I think it was his transportation secretary who resigned earlier today, just less than an hour or two ago. But one of the things I think we need to do first in response to this is we need to remove Donald Trump from office. He has demonstrated he is not fit to lead this country and to make decisions on our nation's behalf. And I actually think the most appropriate way to remove him is for his cabinet and the Vice President Pence, to invoke the 25th Amendment and immediately remove Donald Trump from office. He needs to know that the people who staff his government, that lead his the agencies that lead our nation, do not support him. And I call on Vice President Pence, and I call on all of the secretaries to come together and invoke the 25th Amendment and remove Donald Trump from office. Simultaneously, I absolutely believe Congress needs to impeach President Trump and impeach him in the House, and then the Senate can hold their trial. And then the sentence that I think the punishment that the Senate needs to pass down is to bar or ban Donald Trump from ever holding office again. And I believe that impeachment and that sentence needs to come from a bipartisan, overwhelming chorus of Congress members and senators. President Trump needs to see beyond a shadow of a doubt that everybody in our government condemns what he did and condemns his behavior in office. And not only is he going to be removed from the office of the president, but he will be barred from ever running or holding federal office again in our country. And then third, I call on the Justice Department. I believe the Justice Department needs to, as they already have begun doing, review tape and find the people who breached the US Capitol, arrest them, and charge them with domestic terrorism. What happened yesterday was unprecedented in our nation's history. And we need to have a swift, bipartisan, and just response to it. The challenge is mostly swift, bipartisan responses against by our politicians only come against people of color. And there have been numerous statements and observations already made that the police response and the government's response to the protests that took place over the summer had a much forceful implementation than what we saw yesterday, when it was white Americans who were terrorizing and commandeering our Capitol building and disrupting the work of the United States government. And the response to that, the police response as well as the political response, was much more tepid. And we need our politicians and our law enforcement, our Justice Department, to act in a bipartisan manner to absolutely condemn what happened yesterday. And white America needs to understand that they are not above the law, and that when they do actions like this, there will be consequence. There will be accountability, and they will be brought to justice regarding these types of actions. And so I call on Vice President Pence, I call on the cabinet of Donald Trump to swiftly invoke the 25th Amendment and remove Donald Trump from office. I call on Nancy Pelosi, and I call on Mitch McConnell, and I call on the House and the Senate to impeach Donald Trump and to pass a sentence banning him from holding office in the future and running for office again. And I call on the Department of Justice and law enforcement to track down, find the people who breached the Capitol. They have selfies up there. They have video of themselves. They were quite proud of the way they were acting and the way they behaved. It should not be very hard to find these people. And we need to arrest them and charge them with terrorism, domestic terrorism. I listened earlier today to Mayor Bowser's press conference, And I was very grateful that she labeled what happened yesterday as a terrorist attack. It absolutely was a terrorist attack. They even found pipe bombs, according to an AP report. Pipe bombs were found in front of the RNC and DNC offices, and other weapons were found in a vehicle parked on the Capitol grounds. This was a terrorist attack. And I call on all of our media, national, local media, to refer to this as a terrorist attack. And the people who breached the Capitol building were behaving and acting as terrorists. And Donald Trump, in his speech that morning and in his speech on Twitter that afternoon, was inciting and affirming terrorism. We need to identify this. We need to label it. We need to deal with it swiftly in a bipartisan manner, and we need to make sure that our citizens and our leaders are held accountable for their behavior. This is how we're going to make sure something like this doesn't happen again. If we have a lackluster response, if we have an undecisive Congress and an undecisive Senate, if we have leadership taking both sides and trying to explain this away, this most likely will happen again. We need to have a bipartisan, swift response to what happened yesterday. We need to label it what it was. It was domestic terrorism. And we need to hold those responsible for this accountable to what happened. This includes President Trump. This includes everyone who breached the Capitol building yesterday. And those, especially those who brought weapons or those who came with violence. I think most of us woke up feeling a little unsettled today. I know I've had several conversations throughout the day where I've just had to remind people that if it emotionally and even physically, this is like waking up after 9/11, or this is like waking up after another police shooting where injustice was acted at a national level. And we need to allow ourselves to acknowledge that and understand how that affects us. And then we need to make sure that we don't cope with this by reaffirming our denial, which is what Donald Trump is doing, or by reaffirming our own exceptionalism, the myth of our own exceptionalism, which is what Joe Biden is doing. We need to own that this is who we are. This is our nation's history. This is what we're built on. This is why we are so wealthy and powerful today. This is absolutely what we do. We need to acknowledge that. We need to own it. And then we need to make the intentional decision that we want to change that and become someone different, become something different for tomorrow. There are a lot of other things we need to process through and think about this. And I will continue to do that during my second cups of coffee and on my social media throughout the next few days and even weeks. I understand that Washington, D.C. is under some special regulations right now through, I believe, Mayor Bowser enacted some special limitations through the inauguration. I have been reading and seeing that social media companies like Twitter and Facebook, I believe Facebook just announced that they are prohibiting Donald Trump from using his Facebook account, and I'm assuming his Instagram account, through the inauguration. I know Twitter banned him for 12 hours and maybe will ban him even longer than that. I am glad to see these types of things are happening. The other thing, I'm not going to address this today, but this is something we do need to talk about, is the spiritual and the religious response, especially from Western white evangelical institutions and denominations and churches. Their response to the terrorist attack of yesterday is going to be just as critical as the response of our political leaders. Again, as you've heard me say before, these things are rooted in our nation's history and foundations, which are based on the doctrine of discovery. They are rooted in the myth of American exceptionalism, which is rooted in the lie of white supremacy. And we need to have our spiritual leaders address it at that level. And so I'll be talking about that. I might try to talk about that tomorrow. This plays off a lot of the themes in the book that I wrote on settling truth. And so I'm going to bring in some of the passages I talk about in that book, some of the chapters in that book and what that means. But I want to help our nation kind of process through this and really think clearly about what we've done and how we're going to move forward. And everyone's saying we need to make sure this never happens again. Well, if we want to make sure this never happens again, we have to make some changes at a foundational level. What happened yesterday was not solely just because of Donald Trump. This is what happens when a nation, for 250 years, is rooted on foundations based on white supremacy, racism, and sexism. This is what happens when you tell people over and over that they are exceptional and are not accountable to anything. This is the fruit of that. And so, yes, Donald Trump bears a brunt of the blame for what happened yesterday. But trust me, this is rooted in our nation's history and our dehumanizing past and in our very foundations, our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, and our Supreme Court case law and precedent. And so we need to continue to address this, and we need to make sure that if we want to make sure that this never happens again, that we address it at a foundational level. And unfortunately, Donald Trump nor Joe Biden are willing to do that. Again, Joe Biden yesterday just said, this is not who we are, and then reaffirmed that we're still exceptional. He's not going to be willing to look at the foundational level change we need to make sure this never happens again. He won't be as explicitly destructive as Donald Trump was, but he will make sure that the systems, the status quo, gets put back in place, it's the status quo that allowed this to take place in the first place. And so I'm going to work hard to address this as best as I can over my social media and then in my work, my advocacy over the next 2 to 4 years. So I can't have my relatives. I know these are some deep things that we are trying to deal with. I know that there are a lot of uncertainty. A lot of people are feeling very unsettled right now. And I just want to make sure that we take time to acknowledge that and to acknowledge that we are going through crisis. We are in the midst of some very traumatic times and some trying circumstances. And we need to give ourselves the leeway and the space we need to process these things, to think clearly about them so we can make good, healthy decisions of how we need to change and move forward in a healthy way. I'm advocating continually to create common memory, to wrestle with our unjust foundations so we can build a better community and have a healthier nation as we move forward. I can't have my relatives walk in beauty, and we learn how to walk in beauty together. Hakone.